Hey guys, my name is Max and welcome to Simple Biology. In this video we're going to be talking about active transport. Now if you remember from our last video we discussed passive transport, which uses diffusion to drive that transport process. On the other hand, active transport will actually do the opposite. It opposes diffusion when it does its transport. Now this is going to be especially important when the cell will want to transport more of a substance than diffusion would allow. So like I said, active transport will actually oppose diffusion. In order to do so, the cell will actually need to use energy, usually in the form of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Now when it does so, it allows a substance to travel from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration, which like I said, opposes diffusion. You'll also notice that it always uses a carrier protein rather than a channel protein. Passive transport can use either one, but for active transport, it will need a carrier protein because this allows the cell greater control over the substance that's being transported, and that's very important for active transport. Now, one very significant example of active transport is what's called the sodium-potassium pump. Now, the sodium-potassium pump is actually present in every single animal cell. It functions by pumping three sodium ions out of the cell for every 2 potassium ions that it pumps into the cell. So it kind of does this in a cycle, in that it picks up 3 sodium, it pumps them across the cell, or pumps it across the membrane, where it then picks up 2 potassium and pumps that across the membrane to the other side. You can probably do the math on this one, because sodium and potassium both have a +1 charge. There's a net charge pump of -1 for each cycle. This -1 is present inside the cell. So by the working of the sodium-potassium pump, there's going to be a negative charge inside the cell and a positive charge outside of the cell. This is something that's called membrane potential, which we're going to be talking about next. So membrane potential is a voltage across the membrane. Voltage basically means a separation of charge. So membrane potential is a separation of charge across the membrane. In other words, one side of the membrane is going to have more negative charge, while the other side is going to have more positive charge. This is going to drive another factor of the diffusion in all ions, in any charged substance, because certain substances will be repelled or attracted by negative and positive charges. An electrogenic pump is a pump that will actually generate this membrane potential. Now, one example of an electrogenic pump is the sodium-potassium pump that I mentioned previously. In fact, any pump or any transport protein, in fact, that transports ions or other charged substances will generate a membrane potential. Now that we've talked about this membrane potential and this separation of charges, we can bring up what's called the electrochemical gradient. Now previously, whenever we talked about diffusion, we talked about a concentration gradient, which is essentially just a measure of where substances are more concentrated and less concentrated. Now, the electrochemical gradient factors in this concentration gradient as well as a charge gradient. In other words, the separation of charges between the two sides of a membrane. Whenever we talk about diffusion, especially with ions or other charged substances, they'll actually travel down their electrochemical gradient rather than just their concentration gradient, because that charge will actually play a factor. So, in a way of restating our active transport, any pump that opposes the electrochemical gradient of that substance will use ATP. This is an extension of our definition using diffusion, where any pump that opposes the concentration gradient will use ATP. The electrochemical gradient is more accurate when we talk about charged substances. Now, our last definition is what's called co-transport. Now, in co-transport, there will actually be 2 substances involved being pumped at the same time. One substance will fall down its gradient, while the other substance will be taken against its gradient, will oppose its gradient. so you can kind of see in this this picture, there's a very large concentration gradient of this red circular substance, and so the cotransport will allow it to travel with its concentration gradient, which is a very strong force pulling that, and this other yellow hexagon-shaped substance will be taking slightly against this gradient, but not very much. As a whole, it won't actually use energy, but there might be another pump that's pumping in order to maintain this other concentration gradient. So that's why we included it with active transport. One very significant example of this is with plants. They actually use the hydrogen ion in cotransport. They'll have another pump somewhere over here that's pumping hydrogen ions outside of the cell. So that's why it's using energy. So it uses energy to do that. And then various cotransport proteins, such as this one, will transport other proteins or other substances into the cell, while also transporting the hydrogen ion into the cell. One significant example of this would be when it transports sucrose into its cells, which is very important in plants. And so that's really it for active transport. It's as simple as that.